朋友们看到一个非常好的来自美国方面的视频，我准备给大家转载一下。但是呢，在转载之前，我要多说几句。那就是美国学者讲述了为什么美国近期对中国的观感开始发生巨大变化，尤其是美国人民对中国的好感度开始快速提升，短短几个月增加了 10%。 朋友们，为什么呢？其实他们之前对中国观感不好的原因呢，我认为大约有2个。第一个是来自于中国的确贫穷落后，由此带来的就是人民素质普遍不高。第二个原因就在于意识形态的对立，而我认为第一个原因是最根本的原因，因为中国近代造成的打击实在太大了，所以国家是在一穷二白的基础之上发展起来的。帝国主义从中国掠夺了大量的财富，蒋介石离开之后也把中国大陆搜刮一空，我们是在完全贫穷落后的基础之上建立起来的国家。所以你要知道那个发展有多难。如果你们在看共和国的经济史真的是步步惊心呢。但是我们因为贫穷落后，自然人民的素质不会高，经济是基础但是你发展起来了，很多人可以把孩子送入大学读大学，是更高的进行深造，人民素质开始快速提升所以说呢，这个会让很多外国媒体也不得不承认。而现在呢，我们因为很多方面都开始快速变好，但是西方媒体的宣传呢，依然拘泥于意识形态的对立和冲突。他们之前的很多报道，我们不得不承认是有一些事实根据的，也的确很多方面做得不好嘛。但是中国发展了这几十年，西方媒体的报道却没有跟着发展，他们依然按照之前那个逻辑来进行报道，所以必然导致的结果就是与事实不符合。如果中国是一个封闭的国家，像朝鲜那样，则它无论如何进行抹黑，你也没有办法进行澄清。但是中国又是一个非常开放的国家，咱们开放了各种各样的入境便利，让很多外国网红都可以到中国来实地游玩，通过他们的镜头把真实的中国传播出去。而且呢，中国的社交媒体对其他国家也是开放的，你们都可以进来。所以朋友们，经过这些自媒体的宣传，的确与那些意识形态上档的媒体形成了剧烈冲突，而现在又是自媒体的时代，所以越来越多的西方人认为之前媒体报道不真实是假的由此带来对中国观感的提升这是最根本的原因所以中国政府今年做的动作，现在看起来没有非常有效果。而且还有一个更加重要的是，视频当中也体现出来了，全世界人最渴望的政府是什么样子的？那就是你得有政府的样子，你得非常严肃，而且非常专业，不是那种像草台班子一样子的。但是现在地球上绝大部分的政府都是草台班子，而且没有很好的执政效果。所以相比较而言，中国政府算是非常优秀了，他们也看得到，对不对？这也是其中一个。而且我还非常乐观在哪儿呢？这个趋势还在持续演变下去，他们对中国的好感度还会快速提升，可能到了一个关键节点会立刻发生质变。比如说，如果好感度达到 40% 甚至 50%， 这样的瞬间可能跳到 80%。 原因在哪儿呢？已经占据压倒性优势了，之前可能有一些意见的，将来可能选择闭嘴了。所以说到那个时候，中国其实无论做什么事情， 都会得到欢迎，都会得到赞美，就像很久之前美国所处的那样的结果。这一切的原因在谁呀？在于中国这边一直踏踏实实努力做好自己，美国那边一直努力踏踏实实干坏事，没有办法。
We seem to be witnessing a shift in public opinion about China. It's going on in the United States and also globally as well. In this video, I'll talk about how we know this and why it might be happening. I've talked before on this channel about consistent bias against China in public discourse and in the media. In fact, I remember back in 2005, 2 decades ago, when I was a graduate student at NYU, one of my professors, Joanna Whaley-Cohen, saying to the class, try looking in the New York Times for a positive story about China. It's very difficult to find one. So it's quite a surprise that right now it looks like journalists at the New York Times are leading the charge in the other direction. I'll get to that in a moment. First of all, I want to say that the start of this trend was spotted a few months ago on Sinica podcast by Kaiser Kuo and his guest Jeremy Goldkorn. This was an episode which came out on February the 3rd called Is the US Experiencing a Narrative Shift on China? They discussed all kinds of possibilities, including the affection of young people in the US for TikTok and the phenomenon of large numbers of people migrating onto the Chinese social media platform Xiaohongshu, where they were able to communicate directly with Chinese users. There's also been the shock realization that yes, China is actually quite good at innovation, with recent revelations about Chinese EVs and of course DeepSeek. Interestingly though, they suggested that the biggest reason for the shift might actually be changing views of the US itself. Here's what Jeremy Goldkorn had to say on this.
To me, I think the vibe shift in recent months, perhaps the biggest driver is Trump and a few different aspects of Trump. On the one hand, you know, most of the world is rather horrified by the prospect of another 4 years or another 40 years of his leadership and the uncertainty that it brings and the coarseness, the aggression, the every country for itself attitude, the meanness and the nastiness. And that makes the Communist Party seem rather nice in comparison.
Imagine them being viewed as benign.
That's right.
And indeed, a shift has clearly been happening over at the New York Times in the op-ed writings of the high-profile veteran journalist and leading voice of liberal punditry, Thomas L. Friedman. First, for contrast, here's what he said in 2022 in an op-ed called How China Lost America. As the New Yorker's China expert Evan Osnos pointed out in October, in 2012, 40% of Americans had an unfavourable view of China. Today, more than 80% do, according to the Pew Research Center. To appreciate how badly China has lost America, you could start with this question to Beijing. How is it that you had the biggest, most powerful lobby in Washington and it didn't cost you a penny, and yet you blew it? I want to see the Chinese people thrive. It's good for the world, but they're going down the wrong track today. And when 1/6 of humanity makes a wrong turn in our still very connected world, everyone will feel their pain. Now, that attitude really seems to have changed. Here's the title of one of his op-eds from April this year, in which he waxes lyrical on the stupendous advances China has made in tech in comparison to the US. In this op-ed, he also argues that the best thing America can do now is invite the Chinese in and learn as much as possible from their technology. Incidentally, this is the same argument which Jake Werner at the Quincy Institute was making a year earlier.
I think actually the best solution would be to bring Chinese companies and produce in the United States, and then we should steal their IP.
Werner was vehemently criticised at the time for saying that, though it turns out he was ahead of the curve. I have another video on that. I'll post it below this one in case you want to watch it afterwards. This very stark shift in Friedman's attitude towards China has been picked up by his colleague at the New York Times, Ezra Klein. Klein has a very popular podcast based at the New York Times, and he invited Friedman on there. Together they made a big feature about how the constant China bashing in US punditry and policy circles might actually be very bad for US policymaking.
What if you get into a trade war with China and you lose? I don't think people are thinking enough about how possible that really is. So this conversation we're having emerges out of a conversation we had a little bit randomly on the phone. You had just come from China and I had just come back from book tour. And we were talking about something else, but then I asked you how your China trip was. And what you said to me basically was, Ezra, you have no idea how screwed we are.
Yeah. The episode on YouTube currently has 1.3 million views, which is high even by Klein's own very high standards. But is this all vibes, or do we have some actual hard data on this apparent shift in public opinion? Let's return to the Sinica podcast I talked about earlier. Here's the host, Kaiser Kuo, making a bold prediction.
I mean, how do you think this all plays out? I mean, are we going to see like 6 months from now new Pew polling data on global attitudes that shows actually, a sudden uptick in positive attitudes toward China, at least among, Americans of a younger age group?
That was in February. 6 months from now, at that time, would have been August this year. In fact, this prediction was also ahead of the curve. A new Pew Research Center report on American opinions towards China actually came out in April. And yes, that uptick was already there. The report stated that attitudes toward China have warmed somewhat. For the first time in 5 years, the share of Americans with an unfavourable opinion of China has fallen from the year before, albeit slightly, from 81% in 2024 to 77% in 2025. And the share who have a very unfavourable opinion of China has dropped 10 percentage points since last year. And for proof, here's a graph showing their findings. If you want to see the data in more detail, I'll post the link to the report under this video. And finally, I did say there appeared to be a global opinion shift going on, not just in the US. And the data for that comes from another report from Morning Consult, which came out on May the 13th. Their report states that, per our data tracking public favourability toward China and the United States in 41 countries, China's global standing has now eclipsed that of the United States. This is a first since our tracking began and includes many of America's most important economic and military partners, in a clear blow to US soft power. And in another win for those at Sinica who predicted this shift had a lot to do with a decline in opinion towards America, it also finds Beijing's leg up over Washington, which began in early March, is largely attributable to America's plummeting reputation over 2025, which has seen global favourability of the United States fall far faster than fervour for China has risen. Now, if you'd like to watch that video I mentioned about Jake Werner, it's hopefully showing up on your screen now. Thank you for watching.